lot of what we learn about the Lord's Supper comes from the night that Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper in that upper room. But a lot of what we learn about the Lord's Supper also comes from the Apostle Paul writing about the Lord's Supper to the Corinthians in his first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 11. Paul writes to the Corinthians because there were several abuses of the Lord's Supper that were taking place in the city of Corinth by the people there. And in order to understand this a little bit, you have to understand that the Lord's Supper at that time was connected to something that was called the Agape Meal. The Agape Meal was a gathering where people would come together in Corinth and they would eat together. They would bring food and they would share food with one another. They kind of like a potluck, and they'd eat together. They'd collect offerings for the widows and for the less fortunate. They would have prayers. They would do a lot of things fellowship-wise and some things that we might include in a church service at these Agape meals. However, not too long after Agape meals started to become something that they would do regularly, there became some abuses with these Agape meals. First, those who were wealthy and bringing food to share with others and couldn't bring food to share with others, they began to form cliques, and they began to not share their food with everyone else. And there became divisions among the people. Some of them perhaps were just personality differences, but some of those divisions were because some were rich and others were poor. And so the rich did not want to share their food with the poor, and there became divisions among the people. These Agape meals became less about sharing and more about the different cliques that were formed there. This was not something that was God-pleasing, and not a God-pleasing way to lead into the sacrament of Holy Communion. On top of that, there were those in the church in Corinth that at these Agape meals would drink too much wine. And they were coming to the Lord's table to celebrate the sacrament of Holy Communion intoxicated. And so Paul had several things to write to the Corinthians about their abuses of the Lord's Supper, because the Lord's Supper would typically follow these Agape meals in Corinth. So what Paul does first Paul takes the Corinthians back to when Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper. You'll see something very similar in Corinthians that you saw when Jesus instituted it. He lays out what the Lord's Supper is. That it is the body and blood of Christ in, with, and under the bread and wine for the forgiveness of sins. He lays that out very succinctly in a paragraph there. And then he goes on to say that there is a way to receive the Lord's Supper in an unworthy manner. And that if one receives the Lord's Supper in an unworthy manner, then that person might be guilty of sinning against the body and blood of the Lord. That instead of receiving the benefits of the Lord's Supper, that they would be eating and drinking judgment on themselves, he says. And so in a lot of ways, this makes the Lord's Supper kind of like medicine. If you take medicine, medicine can be of great benefit to your body. It can fight against diseases, illnesses, that kind of thing. And that medicine can cure you, can heal you if taken properly. But if taken improperly, in the wrong dosage, or when someone doesn't really need the medicine, that medicine can do harm to someone's body. What the Apostle Paul lays out here is something similar to that of medicine. The Lord's Supper, it has the power to spiritually heal someone, to give the forgiveness of sins. That's what it promises to give in the bread and wine, body and blood. But if taken in an unworthy manner, it can be taken to the detriment of the person taking it. And so Paul lays out what is necessary to take this sacrament properly. And he says that a person ought to examine themselves prior to coming to the Lord's table. So for the people in the day of the Corinthians, in this letter to the Corinthians, that would have meant not being intoxicated when you came to the Lord's table. Being able to, of sober mind, examine yourself. That is, to and be able to admit that you are a sinner who needs God's forgiveness, to be able to examine your heart and to realize that you have broken the law and that you need the forgiveness that is offered in this meal. A person also needs to be able to remember what exactly they are taking in this sacrament, that they are taking not only bread and wine, but also body and blood in this sacrament. That these things are essential to being able to be properly prepared to take the sacrament and to not take it in an unworthy manner. And so Paul gives us this reminder because he wants the Lord's Supper to be the blessing that it was intended to be. And it is our prayer that we always make a habit of examining ourselves before we come up to communion so that we receive the full blessings of the Lord's Supper. That is, the forgiveness of sins and ultimately eternal life. God bless it and God grant it.